So, how exactly did a radical communist and militant atheist end up the chairman of a county Republican Party and a devout Orthodox Christian? Let's talk about that. This is my journey of why I left the left. And in order to understand it, we've got to go back in time a little bit. I grew up in a pretty liberal household, and I remember the 2012 election being the first one where I was actually more politically involved, or at least aware. And I remember being militantly against Mitt Romney at the time, very pro-Obama. Didn't really understand why. All I knew was what I had been told by the education system, what I had been told by family, that, the Democrats were all about, making sure people have a fair shot, and the Republicans were all about the rich and taking advantage of poor people, taking advantage of non-white people. The pretty standard fare for the Democratic Party and those who hold leftist beliefs. I remember when I became homeless, wondering, why we were in this situation, who was to blame, who was at fault, and of course, for my parents, it was always somebody else, whether that be the rich, whether that be government, whether that be the various social service agencies. They've cut our food stamps, they've cut this benefit or that benefit. A lot of that influenced me. But I remember part of my political shift, or at least part of the cracks starting to show in my ideology, occurred during that time when I was homeless. My parents, I tried to help them out however I could. I was still, of course, a child at the time, but I was trying to help out putting budgets together. I knew how much they were making, how much roughly we were getting in food stamps, and I would do the math and show them, this is the apartments we could afford. Maybe if you made just this much more money, whether it's by shifting jobs or working just a little bit more hours, we can make this work. This is how we make it work. And I remember just how dismissive my parents were. They didn't really want a solution. They were more looking forward to working with the case managers to get us into permanent supportive housing, basically get us into a situation where for the rest of our lives, the government would pay for our housing, or at least a large chunk of it. That was really their goal. They wanted to get me on disability, which they did, and they wanted to leverage that because I have cerebral palsy. So they wanted to leverage that and do the same with my father, get him on disability, and basically create a situation where there was no need for additional accountability, that the government would take care of them. And so that definitely impacted me. I started to wonder, well, hey, I'm trying to come up with solutions here. I'm trying to help. And, I would even fill out job applications for them. I think there might have been some instances where I had landed them some interviews that just never went anywhere because they never took it any further. And I remember one of those experiences wasn't my family, but witnessing another family where the mother was talking to a caseworker or something like that, and she turned down a job opportunity. And basically what she said, and bear in mind she's homeless with her children, basically what she said was, I don't want my food stamps to be cut. And, they would have been, because it would have been considerably more income. This was going from a part-time job to a full-time job. And she turned it down because she wanted the benefits. She wanted that security of basically everyone else paying taxes and supporting her and her children instead of her doing it herself. And that definitely left a mark on me as well. I was still pretty militantly communist. I remember in my high school economics class, like 11th, 12th grade, I'd vandalize the whiteboards with hammers and sickles. And of course, given the liberal state of the education system, this wasn't only not addressed, but encouraged. It was outright encouraged and laughed at and joked at. So, there was that. And I remember some of the biggest cracks started to show as I was getting ready to go to college during this time. As I was working really hard, I knew that I had to do something to get myself out of this situation. I knew that I needed to be able to get some form of not just needs-based scholarship, but merit scholarship. I really needed to prove that I was worth investing in so that I could get out of this situation immediately upon graduating high school. So I devoted myself to my books. I devoted myself to all my learnings, worked really hard, took opportunities that, were definitely above and beyond. I didn't have to do them. One of which was taking college classes in downtown Miami, where I had to take a bus and then a train and then a tram. Had to do that twice a day. It was 2 hours one way, and did that for an entire summer. Was not required for graduation, but I did it anyways. And things like that, going above and beyond and showing to myself what I was capable of, really started to put cracks in my communist ideology, because of course I was showing the power of independence. I was showing the power of, what one can do, really, the whole idea of individualism, what an individual is capable of, especially in America. And so that set a lot of cracks in the foundation as well. Once I got to college, that's when things really began to shift very quickly. So as liberal and radical as I thought I was exposed to a whole new level when I arrived for college. I went to one of the most liberal private schools in the country. And I remember getting exposed to gender ideology very quickly. Now, this was something pretty new to me. I mean, even the whole LGBT whatever, that was new as well, though I'd gotten a little exposure during high school. But in college, I really got thrown into the deep end. And I remember one of the first friend groups that I was maybe going to end up being a part of included this person who was trans, and we were coming out of one of our first year freshman orientation things, and they were going on about how all white straight cis men are evil and irredeemable and all of this. And I thought, maybe they're joking, maybe this is something to laugh at. So I chuckled, didn't really understand what was going on, didn't really get the joke. So I just pretended to chuckle. And I remember this person, they snapped their neck back at me and they said I wasn't joking. And at that moment, I realized this is not my crowd of people. These are not the people I belong with. So I quickly fell out of that friend group, and that's when I started to do a little bit more thinking. Now, at the time, I was still a Bernie Sanders supporter. This was during the 2016 election cycle. And I think in a lot of ways, it makes a lot of sense coming from one populist and then going over to the other populist side, because you could look at Bernie and Trump as the two populists of the right and the left. But I remember, once the primaries were done, once Clinton was nominated, being a Clinton supporter, very anti-Trump, and watching all the debates, we'd get together as a dorm hall. And speaking of that, I was in a dorm that was exclusively for people of color, for non-white people. It was meant to be a safe space, which, in retrospect, looking at it, was really an excuse for modern segregation. But that's a topic for another time. I remember election night, and I was really into politics, really enjoyed it. I had drawn a whole electoral college map, and I was coloring in states on the whiteboards next to the TV and, analyzing and looking at all this. And it was pretty clear as the night went on that Clinton was going to lose and that Trump was going to win. And I remember disappointment, because at the time I still considered myself a Democrat, still considered myself a liberal. And I remember being disappointed, as, most people are when their person loses or is, about to lose. And I thought that was a perfectly normal reaction. What I didn't think was normal was the sobbing, the tears, literally the wails, the moans, the screaming that occurred in that aftermath from some of my peers. And I remember the next day basically being a day of mourning. Classes were canceled. I remember going to one of the classes I was in. It had nothing to do with politics. It was actually a language class. And the professor started with something to the effect of, I know this is a very dark day for all of us. And, there's a lot on our minds in the future of the country. And, all the doom and gloom that the left cried about in the aftermath of Trump's election. I remember people rallying, people protesting immediately. I think I might have even spoken some words of encouragement at one of these rallies. But that really left a lasting impression on me because people were absolutely freaking out, which, while I was disappointed, I didn't see cause to absolutely have a catastrophic meltdown and start saying, he's an illegitimate president and all this and that. But anyways, that came to pass, and I remember it's not too long after that, at the end of the next summer, I ended up going to an Orthodox church, which is a whole story for another time. I was a pretty militant atheist, and I remember walking into this church, and for those of you who haven't been to an Orthodox church, just look it up. Just listen to some of the music and you'll kind of get the feel for what I experienced. But I'm walking into there, I felt that there was something bigger than me present in that room. And so I started diving into it more. And again, this is a whole story for another time that we could dive into. But I ended up becoming an Eastern Orthodox Christian, was baptized not too long after that. And of course, Eastern Orthodoxy is pretty conservative. I would go so far as to say it perhaps might be the most conservative of the Christian denominations. And that also left an impression on me, just learning about the gospel, things I hadn't known anything about before. But perhaps what the final nail in the coffin was that during junior, senior year, I would end up meeting my wife and we'd get engaged pretty quickly, pretty standard in Eastern Orthodox norms. But I remember getting engaged and, friends knowing that I was going to be married, and kind of just the shock and the kind of feeling of anathema coming from these group of people. They were not happy that I was getting married. In fact, one of the first questions I got asked, they weren't supportive of me getting married in the first place, but one of the first questions I got asked was, is this person white or non-white? And then when I responded white, just the egad, the gasps was interesting to say the least. But that happened, and then very shortly after, ended up having my first child as well. Actually, my first child was born my first day of senior year of college. And remember, at institutions of higher education, specifically these elite ones, the Harvards and the Stanfords, those kinds, it's very rare to see parents going through college. People do not have children that young by and large, but especially at these institutions of higher education. So I was even more ostracized at that point. People were absolutely appalled. And I remember, people thinking I was going to drop out, wasn't going to make it through. Meanwhile, for me, I just had faith that God would provide and that we would see it through and that it was a blessing. So those two events were probably the final nails in the coffin of leftism for me. Just the response to marriage and having children, two overwhelmingly positive facets of life, just completely spun in such a negative way. And so I started digging into conservative thinkers, the Ben Shapiros, the Turning Point and Daily Wires of the world, those sorts of things, just learning what I could. And I quickly realized that the way I carried myself, what I believed about human capacity for good, human capacity to achieve greatness, human capacity to overcome adversity, and really the uniqueness of the ability to do those things in America, those were conservative ideas, apparently. I thought they were pretty moderate and, pretty middle of the road, something everyone could get behind, but the left could not get behind that. And I remember talking about my experiences in economics classes and being shut down. I talked about the ability of someone to rise up the economic ladder, to quote unquote pull themselves up by the bootstrap, so to speak. And I remember one of the first responses I got from this liberal student was, well, that's because you're privileged. You probably come from a wealthy background. They didn't know I was homeless. You probably come from a wealthy background, stable household, and all this. And so I started to explain. I was like, actually, no, I grew up homeless. And they were like, oh, well, you're an anomaly. You're not disabled. You have all these things going for you. That's why you made it through. I have cerebral palsy. And then they quipped back, well, you're a male and you're white passing, you're racially ambiguous, which is the left's way of being racist and basically saying, you've got some whiteness in you. We don't like that. And so all of these things just kept pushing me further and further to the right. And it wasn't necessarily that I was just shifting my views, but that it was making me ask questions, which of course is a big no-no for leftism. You do not ask questions, you just follow orders. So I started asking questions, I started doing research, and that's what shifted me more and more towards the right. And I basically found a natural home for my ideas, for my beliefs, for what I truly was embodying, and this whole idea of, we can determine the outcome of our lives. We don't have to live in the shadow of our circumstances. We can rise above that. And that America is a pretty awesome country, honestly. And again, such simple, what I thought benign ideas, just completely anathema to the left. So I pretty much got myself kicked out of the left, got my leftist card revoked immediately, and I was happy to have it revoked. But just started looking at the state of our country and all that's going on from an economic and social perspective. And those are definitely topics for other videos. We can go into some of the specific beliefs and specific ideas, policies, etc. I wanted this to be more about that journey from from left to right. And it's been said before, and I think Reagan actually said this himself, I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me, and that's kind of how it felt. I was growing up right around that time where the left really just started to go off the rails, especially on the social side of things. And it was kind of perfect timing because that kind of saved me. The Democratic Party going nuts and abandoning me at the curbside was a perfect turn of events for what I needed to grow, to mature, and to better understand the world, the political landscape. And so that ended up resulting in me becoming a Republican right around COVID, and especially during COVID with all the shutdowns and the absolute craziness, especially being in some fairly liberal areas during that time before I moved up to Wyoming, got to see just how crazy the left had gotten. So I registered as a Republican and haven't looked back since the 2020 election cycle. Ended up exploring, just getting involved, doing my part to help save the country. And so that resulted in me inevitably joining the Republican Party locally at the local level, getting involved, ended up becoming vice chair, and then later becoming chairman of the party. And so it's just been an amazing journey. It's been a lot of learning. I think a lot of people from my background, whether it be the economic side, whether it be the disability, all of that, I think tends to trap people in leftist thinking because we're a vulnerable group. And I think the left is acutely aware of that, and they leverage that. They leverage that for votes. The comfortable thing to do, at least what we're told by the education system, by the government, which, of course, we've got a Republican government now, but make no mistake, the bureaucracy is full of very much so leftist people. That bureaucracy tells people in poverty that you are owed a debt, that society owes you, and that what has occurred to you is not your fault. And I'm not saying everything is the fault of those who are experiencing poverty or homelessness. No, bad things happen, and bad things happen to good people. That's life. However, You cannot cede all personal responsibility, which seems to be what often these people are told, is that it is none of it is your fault. You just need to kick up your feet, wait for the government to pay you a check, and all will be good. And I just could never live with that. The idea of my greatest aspiration being to collect a food stamp check, collect a disability check for the rest of my life, that didn't seem like life to me. I think we have an obligation to reach our full potential as individuals in all aspects of our life, whether that be physically, whether that be socially, whether that be financially. Not just because we owe it to ourselves, but because we owe it to our neighbors, to our country, to God. I mean, I think we ought to live out our full God-given potential, that we have an obligation to do so and to live our best life while we're here. And our best life is not being permanently on government subsidies. It just isn't. And so a large part of my mission is reaching these folks and helping them see the truth and see the light. You know, I try to divorce politics from the motivational side of what I do and the speaking that I do, but I figured out and learned very quickly, I just can't. Because so much of what I talk about, individual potential, ownership, accountability, all of that, agency, it is incompatible with leftism, because I'm going to a group of folks who are going through a hard time, who may not be white, who may not be rich, who may not have full bodily capability. They might be disabled in one way or another. And I'm going to them and I'm telling them, yes, you are going through some rough times. You've got, some weight stacked against you, but that doesn't define you, and you can find a way to overcome it. You can find a way to look at all these circumstances and consider them as a blessing, as tools to help you help the world, as tools that empower you with unique skills that other people don't have. Because that's how I look at my life. I look at the benefit of circumstance. I wouldn't change anything about my life. I wouldn't change any of the neglect. I wouldn't change any of the abuse. I wouldn't change any of the disability. I wouldn't change the financial circumstances, because I wouldn't be who I am today. I wouldn't be standing here today if it hadn't been for those particular set of circumstances. I wouldn't be the success I am, because the unique skills that I bring to the table, the success that I've grown, is the direct result of those adversities, of learning from them, of seeing the bright sides, of gaining skills in the midst of the fire. All those things make me unique. And so I share that with others, that they need to look at their current circumstances and find the benefit that's in there, and that they need to have this drive in them to be more, do more, say more, and live more. It's an innate drive in all of us, and they need to awaken that. And I used to think that was a pretty universal idea, but it's a conservative idea. No matter how I try to spin it, no matter how I try to communicate it, it always ends up tying back into conservative values and conservative principles of individualism. So that's really my journey of how I went from radical leftist to get to where I am today. And I know this is a longer video and perhaps a little rambly, but I wanted to share this more off the cuff. I didn't want to, script this out or really bullet this out, but share my journey authentically from where I came from to how I got to where I am today. And of course, that journey is still just getting started. I am 27 as of the recording of this video, so it hasn't even been 10 years since I graduated high school, and just very interesting to think back that 10 years isn't all that long ago in the grand scheme of things, how different of a person I was and where I had started. And my hope is that Gen Z, Gen Alpha, and subsequent generations become more conservative, simply just so they can start to see and live out their full potential, because I believe leftism is something that really constricts human potential. It constricts the ability to live a free, independent life, because in the left ideology, you're told that you don't have agency, that, you're kind of stuck and oppressed, which I don't believe whatsoever. Are there unfair things in the world? Absolutely, but nothing's ever going to change that. You got to live through it, you got to see the benefits, and you got to rise up. And I firmly believe that every single last human being can, to unimaginable levels. Even though I haven't met them, every crowd I speak to and every person I meet, I see that potential in their eyes. I see that, deep down in their heart, their capacity to change the world, to change themselves in ways we can't even possibly think of. And it's a profoundly positive way to look at life, to look at others. And I want to share that message with everyone that I meet. But that's all that I've got for you. This is, I know it's been a long video, but this in a nutshell, and I could go on for hours and hours with all different antidotes, but this in a nutshell is why I left the left and how I went from crazed, radical leftist, blue-haired leftist, except in this case my hair was actually dyed silver, but how I went from radical leftist and militant atheist to Orthodox Christian and conservative and Republican leader. So keep an eye out for more videos. There are lots more stories to tell, especially about my faith journey and more about my political journey. But until then, take care and see you next time.